Leanne, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, mute so I don't cough loudly, but thank you, Sharon.
No problem.
Okay, we move from a session on the pandemic, a specific health issue, to more general health issues and communication and raising voices in that sphere. So we've got another 2 papers here, and the first is by Sharon and Victoria. So Sharon, over to you.
Thanks, Leanne. Vic, I'm just wondering if you can share our slides. Great. Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to share our research. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people, which are the traditional custodians of the land on where I am located today, and pay respects to elders and any First Nation colleagues that are with us this afternoon. Thank you, Vic. So my name is Sharon Schoenmaker. I'm a senior lecturer at Charles Sturt University, and I'm a co-researcher on this project with Victoria Erskine. I have a dual focus in this project, and I'm in the privileged position of being part of Victoria's PhD supervisory team. So it's lovely to be working with her as a colleague and a researcher. Thanks, Vic. So our presentation today is a concept paper of Victoria's PhD research. The organisation that we're working with on this particular study is Equally Well Australia. So Equally Well was established by the National Framework, and how those values, I should say, are manifesting in contemporary contexts of practice. The scholarship in this space around collective impact is coalescing around these 4 themes. Firstly, communication. So communication is encouraged to be continuous, flowing and collaborative in nature. What we have observed so far is the need for there to be an intentionality of that communication to achieve strategic objectives. The second theme is relationships. So interpersonal relationships are enablers to collaboration and integral to building trust and genuine engagement. The third theme is collaboration. So collaboration works most successfully when those with the lived experience work alongside those with the technical expertise to solve complex health and social issues, alongside a willingness to disrupt existing systems and forge ahead with change. The final theme is engagement and equity. So the framework has been criticised, particularly around the tenets of engagement and equity. And our research is looking to explore this in particular to ensure that the voice of those with the lived experience is central to the discourse. Vic, I'll pass over to you now to talk through the methodology.
Thanks, Sharon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present this research, still in its early stages. I just wanted to acknowledge my Equally Well colleagues, and a little bit of a small diversion of a backstory to this is that I found myself in a position where I needed a new PhD supervisor, principal supervisor, at the beginning of this year, almost 12 months into my PhD. And it caused me to pivot my work significantly. And what it's actually resulted in is an incredible opportunity to join the Equally Well Collective and explore strategic communication and how that can add value to such an important issue. So thank you to Professor Russell Roberts for taking that on, and to my supervisory team as well. So the research question is really focused on the limitations that potentially pose, or the risks essentially, to this concept of continuous communication as it is described in the model for collective impact, and what it actually means to actually propel the purpose of the network forward into its goals. So I'm focusing the work on how communication functions within the collective impact model to support the organisational agenda, and most importantly, sustainable practice, not only for individuals, but for the collective itself into achieving its goals. So the secondary research questions will look at how continuous communication is operationalised in those different contexts within the Equally Well network, and looking at those relationships within the network between different sectors, communities of practice, and potentially international contexts to this work. It's got quite a following around the world, but we're very much working closely with collaboratives in New Zealand and the UK at the moment, and that's going to form the basis of some of the investigation for this work moving forward. So the theoretical frameworks that will position this work is looking at discourse in the collective and how everybody, how the individuals and organisations within the collective are discovering a shared meaning. I've left off a 2010 reference there. I've just noticed that mistake. We'll also be exploring it, exploring through relational theories, looking at the work of Afifi and Busenel, which Sharon and I have done a bit of work on in the past in terms of individual communication practitioner resilience. And we can see some opportunities there to look at resilient models of practice, not just for individuals, but as from a more collective approach. And of course, this work, the opportunity this work really has opened up is how strategic communication and in its sense of being part of that understanding of the broader network of what's happening in the context of, say, mental health in this case, and its goals to improve the physical health outcomes of individuals, how that operates within a broader system, and the socio-economic, the political environment in which this work is operating will have a huge influence. And I want to reflect on the points made by Jim Marnie this morning, and the goals around strategic communication for this work very much align with his position, which is really nice to see. The methodology I'll be focusing on is a mixed methods approach, and that's the opportunity for this work to really bring the qualitative and quantitative insights together to potentially develop a new instrument around how communication is evaluated, measured, and operates within this collective impact model. So this exploratory sequential design allows me to look at the communication experiences from a range of communities of practice within the Equally Well Collective and explore that through the two lenses that I've just previously mentioned. So the focus is to investigate the nature of continuous communication, to propel a model that, to devise a model that will potentially move the goals of the collective forward in a really positive direction for the future, and hopefully create some learnings that might be added to the broader scholarship around collective impact that is building around the world. Collective impact as a model for genuine engagement within, community engagement within a certain sector, and also for action. I just wanted to draw as our final point here into an example where I've had the privilege and opportunity to be part of one of the activities going on within the collective at the moment. My experience is that working in the Equally Well team, I was part of a campaign that was focused on raising awareness of the inequity in terms of vaccine access for people living with mental illness. The work of, the pandemic and COVID-19 propelled some urgency around this and provided an opportunity for this to be activated more purposefully, but this was already on the agenda for Equally Well around the world. There was data being collected, and I specifically draw attention to the work of New South Wales Health in mapping specific data that you can see on that slide here about the cost and the impact of not having access to vaccines for people with mental illness on the health system, not to mention individual quality of life and those kind of things. So there's a lot of work being going on in this area. The COVID-19 pandemic gave us an opportunity to propel this work forward, and it was a really great opportunity to work with colleagues in New Zealand and the UK specifically, but also from 12 countries around the world who all pledged support in an international campaign to raise awareness of this issue in their own jurisdictions and sectors. So what this highlighted for me as a strategic communication researcher and practitioner is that the measure of success of this work was a matter of perspective. So in the UK, the aim was to propel some awareness around getting action around increasing flu vaccines, which are, there's several barriers to vaccinating for flu with people with mental illness in the UK. In New Zealand, it was about raising this issue more broadly with the senior health authorities in policy, and there was some success in that sense. In Australia, it was about getting it on the agenda and getting the interdisciplinary groups together. And there was some success here in a webinar that Equally Well ran a couple of weeks ago that actually brought a range of people to the table from policy and practice and with lived experience to discuss this topic. And it was a very popular webinar, one of the most popular they've run in the last couple of years. And to see the chief psychiatrist from Australia alongside lived experience experts discussing this topic and medical professionals was a terrific opportunity. But what it highlighted for me is that there was a lot of busy work that went on in generating outcomes and outputs in terms of communication in this particular example. And it highlighted for me, raised questions about what is continuous communication in this context. And the risk is it busy or is it intentional? And that's really opening the door to all the questions that we're looking to explore further in this research. So that pretty much leaves us where we are. And thank you so much for listening.
Thanks to both of you, Sharon and Victoria, for some really important research. And I do some research myself in a similar area. And it just, every time I hear more about it, the importance of getting this right is just so crucial. So thank you very much for that perspective. Again, we'll hold the questions until we've heard from our second speaker this session, which is Renee. So Renee, are you ready to go? Now, I know Renee's been on before.
Sorry, here I am.
Gotcha.
I'm actually as Katerina.
Ah, you're Katerina now. Yeah.
And I just need to, I'm just waiting for Amy to let me share my screen. There we go. Thank you. I'm just concerned that my Macintosh wasn't going to share. So I am now on what people would consider a normal computer. So yes, I am actually at Curtin University, so that is accurate at this point in time. My name is Renee Desai. I am a lecturer in strategic communication, health and web comms at Murdoch University, and I am the project manager for the Australian Asbestos Network, which is a longitudinal case study going into its 16th year next year, and is the basis of my PhD research and predominantly the research that I have been doing for the last 10 years of my career. I've been working on the Asbestos Network for 13 years now. And we're going into iteration 3. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the history of the Asbestos Network, the challenges we're really facing, especially now during COVID times, in communicating health issues, digitally especially, and sort of what our direction is going forward. Before I continue, I want to do two things. The first one is I'd like to just give a trigger warning at this point. I am going to be talking about asbestos-related issues, and we'll be mentioning the word cancer a number of times through this presentation due to the nature of the topic. So I won't be offended if you want to switch off now, if that's something you're not keen to listen to. And the other thing I'd like to do as an acknowledgement of country on behalf of Murdoch University, although I'm sitting at Curtin, so I'll do it on behalf of both universities. We acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of this country and its waters, and that Murdoch University and Curtin stands on Noongar country. We pay our respects to Noongar elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their wisdom and advice in teaching and cultural knowledge activities. So this is the first iteration of the Asbestos Network, and interestingly, I gave my first presentation on the project in 2010 at the Darwin Conference during the research stream. It happened to also be the same year that the comms manager, or the then communications manager of James Hardie Industries, gave a keynote at that same conference, at the exact same time I was presenting. So this project has a very interesting history. Most of us in Australia know what asbestos is. When I say most, there is a growing group of people who are not overly aware, and we'll talk about them a bit later. So the Asbestos Network came out of NH and MRC funding, which was very unusual back then for a humanities project such as this. But it came about because of a collaboration between Murdoch, Curtin and specifically UWA, who at the time, through Professor Bruce Robinson, that some people might know, had applied successfully for a Centre of Excellence grant of $30-odd million to try and find a cure for the insidious and horrible asbestos-related cancer, mesothelioma, and related palliative as well as other treatments for other asbestos-related diseases, including the lung disease asbestosis, which you might have heard about. And again, some, including myself, may have been impacted through friends and family and loved ones by these diseases. So it was funded between 2008 and 2012, although the project actually started in 2006. And I call this the never-ending research project because it is still going 16 years later and has there is no plans to close it or shut it down anytime soon. The initial intention was to tell the stories of people who had been affected by these diseases, who had worked at Wittenoom in the north of Western Australia specifically. And the original team were made up of some people that you might recognise: Professor Mia Lindgren, who is at Swinburne University, Associate Professor Gail Phillips, who was the former manager of the ABC and Dean of School of Arts at Murdoch, Chris Smythe, who is a former MEAA president, and myself, and of course the very eminent Professor Lenore Lehman, who is a historian. And we but we came together with the amazing team at UWA, specifically Professor Bill Musk, who only passed away 3 weeks ago, to try to give a legacy and to bear witness to the effectively what is known as an industrial disaster around the mining, manufacturing of asbestos products in Australia, predominantly coming out of Wittenoom. WA is known as the asbestos capital of the world, particularly specific areas of WA. We've all heard of Fremantle, and that is a asbestos hotspot in Australia. But of course, it has had an impact all over the country. There's other mine sites and locations, and Bayugal in New South Wales is another one that's known. Asbestos is not banned all over the world. We banned the import and export of asbestos in 2003, which was not that long ago. And the current communication is that any property built before the 1990s is likely to have asbestos in it if it hasn't already been remediated. So we built this portal with the intention of just telling those stories. So it's absolutely a historical project at the time, but it very, very quickly, as within, I would say, a month of putting this together in 2008, we realised that we had a role to play, and more importantly, a moral obligation to get involved in the communication of asbestos in the country at the time. So in 2008, there were myriad, I can't even tell you, myriad websites on the web related to asbestos communication, but nothing specific to remediation, to awareness raising or risk communication. It was very much still within a legal advocacy area, as we can imagine, because when we launched, the Bernie Banton story was still very, very ubiquitous in the media. It was all over the place. And that, interestingly, has since died down. So we produced this online health portal, which was driven by the history and the personal stories, following Health on the Net guidelines. But to be honest, as journalists and communications people back then, we just had to have a stab at the information architecture and the content strategy, and take what we knew to be the important elements of that story and to get it online and really see what happened after that. Of course, it was a brand new website. We had no analytics. We were doing focus grouping and all sorts of things to start with, but we really just wanted to put it out there and see what people thought. That was back in 2010 when we launched. We're now in 2021. So 11 years later, And we've just had National Asbestos Awareness Week, and the website was quite prominent in various media stories and now being referenced regularly as a source of information. I'm not going to go into detail on the actual website itself. It can take up to 3 hours to listen to all the stories. It's very it's significant, and please feel free to go and look at it whenever you want to. There has been a book written from the project as well, Asbestos in Australia, which was published a couple of years ago. So it was aimed to tell the history, the personal stories, but most importantly, and this is really where we've done really well, is to provide an authoritative, credible and objective medical and public health source, which didn't exist at the time and is now in a very different space. It was designed to be accessible. So we took very interesting and difficult information from public health medical research and translated that through the journalistic process. And then we integrated social media. Now we launched this project in 2006, which is when Facebook launched. So our website has literally grown at the same time as social media and the participative web, which has been fascinating for me as from my PhD, just trying to finish that chapter at the moment. And where we were in 2010 and where we are now, two completely different worlds. And of course, we're going into Web 3.0 going on now. So what the impact that this project has had through communication and engagement has been quite substantial. The research group and the comms, specifically led by me, particularly through stakeholder engagement, we've developed a very strong network across Australia. People we're still working with now, a decade later, in the health department, the national agency, which was set up following the asbestos management panel that we were asked to be involved in. But very importantly, in 2008, this project was produced into an ERA impact case study, which was one of very few humanities projects in science translation. So that was an exciting outcome, not necessarily of the project itself, but from a comms perspective, being able to produce an impact case study on a longitudinal project is, from our perspective, an outstanding outcome. So feel free to go and read that if you have time. So this is where we are today. This is not actually updated. There's an updated homepage from a couple of weeks ago. This is iteration 2.0 in WordPress. The original one was a custom-built .NET system. And this is the one that I've been working on now since 2015, and we will going into a third iteration process next year, currently. And our role in communication, specifically of risk and risk mitigation when it comes to asbestos communication in Australia, is not as advocacy. We're not public health. We don't deal with legal matters or promote asbestos services, which is very important, or give people personal medical advice. But we are there as an enabling platform for all the major organisations operating in Australia in the asbestos arena, to bring their information together and then communicate that out to the myriad, diverse and very shall we say, complex asbestos community in Australia. So I have become a primary conduit around the world for people wanting information and to provide support, and then make those judgments as a communications manager for this project where that information should go. It's actually quite a unexpected role, but something that we've grown into. A lot of people thought that this project, being called the Australian Asbestos Network, was primarily Australian, primarily West Australian. That is definitely not the case. We've hit most parts of the world. This is just a snapshot of the web analytics. At one stage, we were the #1 website in Australia. And we continue without really too much change in the content on the site. We continue to stay on the top page of Google for asbestos communication. through a very hard-fought content and IA strategy that I've been working on for now going on 11 years. So where are we now? Well, what have we learnt? From a communications perspective, we know there's a major gap in communication awareness and education because we don't really know why and how people make decisions about dealing with asbestos. Excitingly, 2 weeks ago, the national agency put out a new report. So they've gone and done some of that research for us, which is amazing, which I'll show in a minute. But we do know there's enormous amount of credible and authoritative information on the web now. But again, where we were 10 years ago, there was not enough. Now there's too much, and we're facing a completely different scenario. But the key strength is this amount of information that's readily available to the community. And my job is to figure out how to curate that and how to develop that into a strategy going forward. So just last week during Asbestos Awareness Week, one of the, a highlight of the issue that we're facing in Australia right now is this third wave of asbestos disease that we're expecting, specifically in the Gen X cohort of people who may have been exposed to asbestos through home renovation, potentially when they were younger. And unfortunately, that was highlighted by this story, a Perth man succumbing to mesothelioma at 45 years old. That necessarily means he was exposed when he was about 5. Meso has a good 30 to 40 year latency period before it turns up. And then the unfortunate prognosis is no more than about 5 years, often less from diagnosis. It's a disease we do not want people to get, and it is largely preventable in the Gen Y and Gen Z audience or cohort, which we're looking at the moment. Asbestos is a known type 1 carcinogen listed by the World Health Organization, but like a lot of cancer-causing substances in our built environment, including lead, silica, all sorts of things, often the attitude is that something else is going to get me before this does. And that is not the attitude that we need we're dealing with now. We need to communicate because we can't stop the Gen X wave at this point in time because people were exposed them many years ago, but we can stop the Gen Y and Gen Z wave from coming. So the national agency put out some interesting data last week. Specifically, a question we get a lot is how much legacy asbestos is out there. And according to them, there is about 6.4 million tonnes of asbestos in the Australian built environment. And there's just some examples of that: cement sheeting, which makes found in commercial buildings, sheeting in domestic buildings, no fences, eaves, sheeting behind electrical boards, all those sorts of things. Cement piping can often be as insulation underneath air conditioning units. It's in there and it's everywhere. Some other interesting data, which is the data I've been looking for and waiting for a long time, is what do people know about this? Who are they? And who should we be communicating to? So just some overarching data here. 60% of Australians at the age of
Okay, we have frozen, I think. I'm assuming not everyone else can.
90.
Oh, here we go. Renee, you've frozen there for a moment.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? That's
yep,
great.
but if you can start wrapping up as well, that would be good.
Sure.
Thank you.
Almost finished. The big one for me here says that 70% agree that builders, governments and hardware shops should show more asbestos information, which doesn't exist. It sounds a bit silly, doesn't it? People should be telling people about asbestos, which has been in the country for nigh on 100 years. It doesn't make any sense, but the data's come out. So this is where we're at. We're going to be developing the third wave story, doing more personal stories. We're going to be developing further the medical and public health information because there has been some amazing strides in the last decade. will be producing a social media platform through evidence-based communication strategies. We'll be delving into podcasting, which is scary but interesting and fun. We'll be developing a new evidence-based stakeholder and community engagement campaign, doing a critical analysis, which we've started, of the effect of COVID-19 on digital communication of respiratory illnesses that aren't COVID, and how that is playing out in the digital sphere. And then an analysis and production of content related to the 18 to 35-year-old cohort, so that we can help and enable the asbestos community to stop people from exposing themselves to this carcinogen that could potentially, even though it's very low risk, a high risk, low probability, exposing themselves to this disease that can cause all sorts of destruction on people's lives and those of their loved ones. And that is it about the Australian Asbestos Network.
Thank you very much, Renee, for that insight into this long-term project. I think the thing that links these two papers, on mental health communication and asbestos communication, is the strength of the communities of practice that are perhaps providing some voices for those that are unable or unwilling to be able to speak up themselves. So thanks very much. I'll open up now to questions or comments. We're getting a few through in the chat room, but any questions for either of the papers?
Can I just, before I quickly add that I didn't mention that, unlike a lot of strategic application in practice, the Equally Well Collective has been so open to what we can offer and bring. And I think Renee is probably echoing that. It's been super encouraging to not bat your head against a brick wall, to actually they're desperate for our input. And I think that's terribly encouraging for what we can do, and as researchers, what we can sort of discover and add to discussions about engagement. So I just wanted to add that in there.
That's great. Renee, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, look, I think in our field, there hasn't been, or there are now, which is great, and we hope that we've sparked other people to want to do this. But what we found is we just had to learn by doing and lead by doing, and the more that we can show impact through communication, the more the science and health and medical community came along, to the point where I wanted to close this down in the middle of this year because I'm getting close to my PhD and finishing, and I just don't know how I'm going to fund it going forward. And that all changed when the National Centre for Asbestos Related Diseases emailed me and said, "What are you doing? Don't shut it down. Come to us. Let's get more funding." So, that it's just a testament to the power of storytelling and the power of communication and showing our value.
Thank you. I think that's a message that's relevant to all our presentations today, indeed. So any further questions or points? No? Okay, well, we're actually on schedule for a change. So, and we have another break coming up, or we have another break now. So our next presentation isn't until 2:30 Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne time.